Good morning. We will pay attention to the general ledger today. The general ledger accounts are provided on the 30th of April. That means the last day of the previous month. Then the journals were completed for May 2015, and we have to post the entries to the general ledger now. All these accounts will be opened with the balances that appeared in the ledger accounts on 30 April. Capital is equity. Equity increases on the credit side. Equipment, inventory, debtors, and bank is assets. Assets increase on the debit side. Creditors control is a liability that will increase on the credit side. Cost of sales expense, debit side. Sales income, credit side. So the capital account, the creditors control, and the sales account will be opened with the balances on the credit side. The assets and expenses will be opened with the balances on the debit side. In the debtors journal, the amount is only recorded in one column and not in two columns. Therefore, the sales figure will be posted to two accounts, one on the debit side and one on the credit side. We are selling these goods on credit, so we have to debit our debtors control account to increase the debtors. Assets increase on the debit side. And we will credit the sales account to increase the income on the credit side. The cost of sales account, we will also have to complete a double entry. Cost of sales is an expense. Expenses increase on the debit side. Inventory is an asset. We decrease the inventory because we are selling our inventory. So inventory decreases on the credit side. The balance in the capital account was brought down on the first day on the credit side because equity increases on the credit side. Equipment is an asset. The balance is brought down on the debit side because assets increase on the debit side. The same with inventory and debtors and the bank. The balances will be recorded on the debit side because assets have debit balances. We sold goods to the debtors, so we will post it to the debit side of the debtors control account to indicate that the asset increases because the debtors owe us more money. And we will indicate that the double entry will be in the sales account on the credit side. The sales account was opened with a credit balance because income have credit balances. We sold goods, so the income increased with 15,200. The debtors control account was debited, so we will indicate that this amount will appear on the debit side of our debtors control, and we will indicate that this was posted from the debtors journal. The cost of sales account will be opened with a balance on the debit side because it's an expense. We sold goods and the cost price of these goods were 10,350. So we will debit the cost of sales account to increase the expense. The account that will be credited will be the inventory account. So we indicate that this double entry will be found in the inventory account. And in the inventory account on the credit side, we will indicate that the double entry appeared on the debit side of cost of sales, posted from the debtors journal, and inventory decreased with 10,350. In the debtors allowances journal, the amount is also only recorded in one column. Therefore, we have to do two entries, one debit and one credit for each amount. Debtors allowances will be debited because debtors allowances decreases the sales and that means it must decrease the profit on the debit side. The debtors owe us less money, so we have to indicate that the debtors, that's an asset, will decrease on the credit side. We receive the inventory back, so inventory that's an asset will increase on the debit side, and the expense for cost of sales will decrease on the credit side. The debtors control is credited with 420. Totals are always posted on the last day of the month, and we will indicate that this entry will be found on the debit side of the debtors allowances account, and it was posted from the debtors allowances journal. The debtors allowances account is debited on the last day of the month, indicating that the double entry was in the debtors control on the credit side. Because the goods were returned, they are not sold anymore, so we have to reduce this expense for cost of sales, crediting the expense account with 290 Rand and debiting the inventory account to indicate that the double entry will be in the inventory account. This is posted on the last day of the month. The inventory account will be debited to indicate that the inventory was returned, so we have more inventory and the cost of sales account was credited. The creditors journal will be posted, crediting the creditors control because we bought goods on credit and liabilities increase on the credit side. Trading stock is an asset. Assets increase on the debit side. Equipment is an asset that will increase on the debit side. Stationery is an expense that will increase on the debit side. And the total amount that we have in creditors control on the credit side will equal all these amounts that we will record on the debit side of the appropriate accounts. The creditors control account is credited to increase the amount on the credit side. Because we're going to debit several accounts on the debit side, we will show that this amount is posted to sundry accounts, different accounts on the debit side. We purchase equipment, that is an asset that will increase on the debit side with the 1,500. Inventory is an asset that will also increase on the debit side with the amount that we paid for the goods. Stationery is an expense that increases on the debit side, so the stationery account will be debited with 300 Rand. And in all three of these accounts, we will indicate that the creditors control account was credited. So the amounts that we recorded in the inventory, equipment, and stationery account on the debit side equals the amount on the credit side of the creditors control. Totals are posted on the last day of the month. Amounts that's in the sundry columns will be posted on the day that the transaction occurred. After we posted the entries to the general ledger, we will record the folio number of the ledger to indicate that these amounts were posted to those specific ledger accounts. If it's an amount in the sundries column, I will show the folio number between the amount and stationery. As soon as we enter something in the sundry column, these two are twins. We have to show the amount and the ledger account that it would be posted to. In the creditors allowances journal, we will reduce the creditors because we owe them less money. A liability increase on the credit side and will decrease on the debit side. We are returning the inventory, so we want to decrease this asset on the credit side. We are returning stationery, so we want to decrease the expense on the credit side. Because we are returning the inventory, we will credit the inventory account to decrease the asset on the credit side with 580, indicating that the creditor's control account will be debited with this amount. The stationery account will also be credited to decrease the expense for stationery, indicating that this double entry appears on the debit side of the creditor's control. So the amount in your stationery account and inventory account on the credit side will equal the amount on the debit side of the creditor's control. Because this 610 is divided between two accounts on the credit side, we will indicate sundry accounts, so the amount is not posted to a specific account, and we will show that this was posted from the creditor's allowances journal. In the cash receipts journal, we received money and will therefore increase the bank on the debit side. Sales is an income that will increase on the credit side. Debtors control will be credited to decrease the debtors because they owe less money. The amount in the cost of sales account is not entered in another column, so therefore you will post it to two accounts. One account on the debit side, you will debit cost of sales to indicate that the expense will increase, and you will credit your inventory account to indicate that you have less inventory. The bank account is increased on the debit side with the total amount received. This amount will be posted to various accounts on the credit side, so you will either show total receipts or sundry accounts on the debit side. The debtors control will be decreased on the credit side with the amount that they paid to show that the total balance of debtors decrease. The sales account will increase on the credit side with the money that was recorded on the debit side of the bank account. In the cost of sales account, we will indicate that cost of sales increases on the debit side and that the inventory account will be credited. In the inventory account on the credit side, we will indicate that this was posted from the cash receipts journal and that the cost of sales account was debited with this amount. In the cash payments journal, we paid out money, so our bank decreases on the credit side. We purchase inventory, so the asset increases on the debit side. We paid the creditors, so we owe less money to the creditors, so we will debit our creditors control. The creditors control is debited with the amount that was paid to them, posted from the cash payments journal, and we indicate that this amount appears on the credit side of the bank account. In the inventory account, we will also debit the inventory account with the total inventory purchase, indicating that the double entry on the credit side of the bank account, and in the bank account we will show total payments or sundry accounts to indicate that this 19,400 appears on different accounts on the debit side. After we recorded all the entries, we will balance the accounts. If there's only one amount in an account, it means that amount is automatically your balance. Because it's on the credit side, it will appear on the credit side of the trial balance. Equipment has two amounts on the debit side, so you will add them up, and the balance is the total, and the 14,700 will be recorded in the trial balance on the debit side. Inventory have amounts on both sides, so it means we have to work out the balancing figure. Inventory is an asset, so the debit side must always be bigger than the credit side. So I will add up the figures on the debit side to determine the total, subtract the figures on the credit side to work out what is the balancing figure. and that balance will be carried down above the total. The two totals will always be on the same line, and you're not allowed to have any words next to the total. That balance is brought down below the total on the first day of the following month. The same with the debtors control. It is an asset, so I will add up the debit side, and then I will subtract the amounts on the credit side from the 30,000, determining that the balance on the credit side is 18,580. And on the first day of the next month, we will bring down that balance on the opposite side below the total. And we will do the same in the bank account. The inventory, debtors, and bank is assets. So because these balances are brought down below the total on the debit side, they will appear in the trial balance on the debit side. Creditors control is a liability. Liabilities always have credit balances, so the credit side must be bigger than the debit side. So I add up the credit side, subtract the debit side, working out what is the balance, record the balance above the total, bring down the balance on the first day of the next month below the total on the opposite side. Because the creditors control balance is brought down on the credit side, it will be shown in the trial balance on the credit side. When we look at the trial balance, we will see that capital will be on the credit side because capital always has a credit balance. All the assets will have balances on the debit side. Creditors control is a liability that will have a balance on the credit side. Cost of sales is an expense with a debit balance. Sales is an income with a credit balance. Debtors allowances and stationery is expenses with debit balances. After we recorded all the balances, we will add up the trial balance, and both these totals must be the same. If they're not the same, it means that you made a mistake somewhere and you have to go and look for the mistake. What did we learn? First of all, you must determine to which ledger accounts the entries must be posted from the journals. Then you determine whether the ledger account must be debited or credited. Entries that's recorded in the sundry accounts column must be posted to the ledger on the date of the transaction. The total of columns in any of the subsidiary journals will be posted to the ledger on the last day of the month. The balance on the debit side of a ledger account will appear on the debit side of the trial balance. A balance on the credit side of the ledger account will be recorded on the credit side of the trial balance.